My name is Dean. The story I'm about to tell you, well, is going to seem unbelievable. And honestly, if it hadn't happened to me, I wouldn't believe it either. But I'm begging you to listen to what I'm about to tell you. Please, it could save your life one day. So, how to begin this story of mine? Well, I suppose I could take you back to where it started, which would make sense. It was about 7 months ago on a beautiful spring day. I lived in a small town in northern Pennsylvania at the time. Actually, it's considered more of a borough than a town, but that's just semantics. I was there staying with my grandma at the time. Her health was bad and my parents didn't have the ability to go there to help her. My dad was a business manager for a large corporation down in southern Pennsylvania, and my mom traveled a lot due to her job as an assistant with an international publishing company. My dad was an only child, so he couldn't call a sibling to go in his place. I was 19 at the time, and so my dad asked me if I would go. I know a lot of you are probably wondering why I'd say yes to that. Well, if you have to ask, then you haven't had a good relationship with your grandparents. I loved my grandma. I was the apple of her eye, she would say. She was in her late 80s, so she would say old corny things like that. But honestly, it always brought a smile to my face. She was a kind woman. I always remember her smiling or laughing. But those times had started to become a lot less frequent. She had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer a few months prior, and her body wasn't responding well to treatments. So when he asked me, I volunteered without hesitation and set out a couple days later. The first week there was pretty rough. Grandma was sick all the time due to the chemo. She looked horrible, her skin sagging more off her body from the drastic weight loss. Her hair completely gone now, a rag covering the top of her head. Her face was gaunt and her eyes looked tired, almost as if she'd seen the lifespan of 1,000 years. But no matter what happened, she always kept that smile. As the weeks went on, her health was like a roller coaster. Some days there'd be some peaks where she would be fine and decently active considering her physical state. But others would have her curled up in bed, sick to her stomach, and in a fetal position. But still, that smile never faded. I'd been there a month, and on that particular day, the sun was shining outside the window, and a nest of birds were chirping outside my window. As I threw on my clothes and walked out of the room, I was greeted by the sound of her TV. She was watching her morning soaps like she always did. She'd watched the show since she was a young woman and had never missed an episode, she'd always claim. I walked up to her door, which was slightly ajar, and gently knocked. She looked over at me and smiled. Well, if it isn't my favorite grandson. I'm your only grandson. That's why I'm your favorite, I replied. She cocked her head sideways slightly with an impish frown. Isn't that reason enough to call you my favorite then? I just smiled and walked into the room, kissing her on the forehead. How are you feeling? I asked. She grabbed my hand and looked me in the eye. Like an old chiving ran me over, but all things considered, that's an improvement. I just shook my head and chuckled. I told her I was going to head into town for a little bit to get some fresh air and to pick up a few things for the house. She reminded me that she needed some more of her flavored waters she'd grown to love. Always black raspberry and white grape. I nodded and told her I loved her and then headed to my car. Now, as I told you already, this was a very small town. Less than 1,000 people lived here, most of which were residents in their mid-50s or higher. But all of them were mostly nice, with the occasional goat who had a grudge with anyone that wasn't his pet dog. Being such a small place, I didn't really have a reason to drive, but I wanted to feel the wind in my face today. As I drove towards the store, I noticed the small trader's market was open. People would go there and try to sell their old hand-me-downs or handmade items to other townsfolk or out-of-towners who'd come driving by. It didn't happen often, but on occasion it'd get pretty busy there due to the neighboring town coming to pick up fresh foods or some kind of homemade furniture. Sometimes they'd even come to set up shop here for a day or so themselves. And today was one of those days where I just couldn't help myself. I'd seen a few new faces amongst the normal gathering of vendors and decided to take a pit stop. Maybe I could find something to bring home to Grandma, I thought to myself, with a small smile spreading across my face. She always loved going to markets like this, and she'd often take me when I was younger. So I pulled into a spot and started to look around. I saw the old guard there, as always. Mr. Phillips with his wooden furniture, mostly end tables or chairs, but still good quality. There was Mrs. Franco selling her jellies and jams as usual, and others I'd come to know over the years. A few new faces were there, but mostly it was just offhand stuff, junk at best. But as I was walking around the last line of vendors, I saw something that caught my eye. A brilliant swirling blue light. It was hard to see what it was from far away, but for some reason, I was in awe of it. I started walking towards it and finally made it to the very last vendor. I turned and saw a small woman. She was in a nice floral patterned dress. Her snow-white hair rustled in the warm breeze, and her hands were riddled with liver spots and varicose veins. She looked up at me and gave a smile. She was an Asian woman. I'd guessed Japanese by the look of the white cat figure sitting next to her small cash tin on the table next to her. I remember it being called a fortune cat, or at least that's how it was translated in the English in the anime I'd seen it in. I smiled back in response, and then my eyes finally saw it. In the middle of the table sat a round jewel. It was maybe the size of my palm. It was mostly clear, but interlaced inside of it were what looked like vibrant streaks of blue, almost like lightning bolts scattering from a storm cloud. I looked down at it, and she seemed to notice because she quickly stood up and asked me, "You find something you like?" Gesturing towards the sphere. I nodded and asked, "What is it?" She walked over to it and picked it up in her hands. "This is very special piece. This is Hosho no Mori Otome, Jewel of Forest Maiden." I studied the object in her hand, and its beauty was stunning. The crystal was clear and completely transparent except for the blue streaking design. I asked her what it was for, and she just smiled. "It is charm of serenity and peace, very popular in my home village when I was a little girl. This was my Okasan's, my mother's." I studied it for a moment as she held it in her hand and then looked her in the eyes. "Why would you sell it if it was your mother's?" She shook her head and looked down at the ground. "I never have children and have no one to pass on to, so I decided to sell it and hope it bring comfort to those who need it." Her story touched me, more than I thought it would. And looking at it, I knew it would bring a smile to my grandma's face. A surprise gift is just what she needed to add to this already nice day. So after a few moments of talking, she told me that I could have it for $15, a steal really for something this size and craftsmanship. She handed the jewel to me and smiled as a brisk wind picked up, sending a chill down my spine. A storm must be heading this way, I thought, so I waved to her and carried my purchase back to my car. I made my way to the store to finish the errand I had already planned. It was a low-traffic day, much like every other day in this town, so it didn't take long to get there. I was about to open the door when I heard a faint whispering. I stopped for a second and looked around the front seat of my car. It sounded like it'd come from right next to me, but that's silly since I was the only person in the car. Must have just been the wind rustling around inside here with me, I considered. Wouldn't be the first time I'd heard whispers in the wind, as the old saying goes. Plus I saw a couple of older women standing a few cars down from where I parked, so it could have easily been them I heard. Still, it freaked me out for a moment, but I just shook off the feeling and made my way into the store. I picked up the water for Grandma, as well as a few other odds and ends we needed at home, like milk, pepper, and trash bags. I decided to pick up some noodles and beef broth to make a nice beef noodle stew later tonight, using Grandma's home recipe to add some spices to it that made it taste amazing. I was making my way up to the checkout when suddenly my whole cart jerked to a halt, and I run stomach first into the handlebar in front of me. Stunned for a moment, I held my stomach as I'd been walking pretty briskly, and so the bar had hit pretty hard. I looked at my cart, which was now sitting there leaning oddly to the right. I looked around to the side of the cart where it was leaning, and I noticed that the front right wheel had completely fallen off. The metal pin that had kept the wheel in place had apparently snapped in two, and the wheel just went. Luckily, an employee came over pretty quick and helped me transfer my items to another cart. The assistant manager was there a few moments later. an older gentleman who was balding on top with a very friendly face. He examined the piece that had broken and had apologized to me profusely for the incident. "The part looks like it's rusted through and just split in two, but this is one of our newer carts and it's barely a year old. It shouldn't have anywhere near this amount of damage on any part of it," he said, confused and a little agitated. I told him it was fine and that these things just happen sometimes. He apologized again and wished me a pleasant day before returning his gaze to the piece in hand, shaking his head a little as he did. Little did I know that that moment was just the beginning of my troubles, the calm before the storm. After checking out and returning to my car, I started the engine and began to pull out. I rode my stomach a little, still tender from my run-in with the cart. I can honestly say it was a first for me to have something like that happen. The drive home was pretty nice, and again, there was no traffic. The sun was high in the sky with a nice scattering of white clouds, and a warm breeze spread across my face. I looked over and saw the Jewel sitting in the passenger side seat, the sun reflecting off of it and lighting up the front seat with its unique shimmering blue sheen. I couldn't wait to get back to the house and show Grandma. I finally reached the house and started to pull in, but as I tried to slow down to turn in, I pushed on the brake pedal and it went all the way to the floor. No brakes. I had no brakes. I quickly tried to swerve away from the house just out of an instinctual reaction and ended up taking out my grandma's mailbox before running over the flower bed. The car was slowed down by the flower bed's wooden frame border, and I was able to get it to stop with the use of the emergency brake. I shook my head as I unbuckled my seatbelt and climbed out of the car. "Dean, are you okay?" I heard Grandma yell as she made her way slowly down the porch stairs. She had apparently been sitting on her porch swing enjoying a bit of tea. "Yeah," I said, a little stunned. "I don't know what happened. I tried to stop, but the brakes didn't work." I walked over and picked up the now dented and nearly flattened mailbox. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I'll replace the mailbox and help you plant new flowers." She walked over and placed a hand on my cheek. "I'm not worried about those things. They can be replaced. As long as you're okay, that's all that matters," she said with that gentle tone and warm smile that I'd known all my life. I gathered up the groceries and headed into the house with Grandma in tow. I started to put it away when I remembered that I had left her gift out in the car. I told Grandma that I'd forgot something outside in the car and that I'd be right back. She was on the phone calling a tow truck all ready to help her get her car to the mechanic. I wasn't really a car-savvy person, so we would definitely need the help of a professional. I walked out to the car and looked at the seat. It wasn't there. Must have rolled onto the floor after I ran over the flower bed. I climbed to the front seat and began looking around. It wasn't long before my hand found its way around the smooth surface of the Jewel. I pulled it out from underneath the passenger seat and held it in my hand. A sigh of relief escaped my mouth as I looked at it. Not a scratch on it and still in one piece. I turned around and headed back to the house, hiding the Jewel behind my back as I entered. "The tow truck should be here in 20 minutes or so," she said as I walked through the door. I walked up to her and told her to close her eyes. "You aren't going to stick a wet finger in my ear like you did when you were 9, are you? I still can't get the feeling of wet slime out of it." She chuckled at her little quip and I just shook my head, returning a smile. "I promise, no wet willy. Just close your eyes and hold out your hands." She obliged. I set the Jewel down in her hand. She opened her eyes and studied it for a moment. "It's beautiful," she said. "What is it?" I began to tell her about the old woman from the market and the story behind the Jewel. She looked down at it with a smile and then back to me. She gave me a hug and told me how blessed she was to have such a wonderful grandson. She decided to take it to the living room and make a place for it on the mantel of the fireplace. That way the sun would strike it and the colors could light up the room. I agreed that it would be the perfect place for it and returned to putting away the groceries, happy with the good deed I'd done to bring a smile to her face. Later that day, the mechanic called the house. He'd inspected the brakes, and after a little testing, he concluded that the brake system had malfunctioned. Parts had come loose around the rod connecting the brake pedal, and the brake system wasn't able to build up any pressure to activate the brake discs on the wheels. It was a weird situation to be sure, but not something he'd never seen before. A 1 in 1,000 chance situation, he said, adding that I was lucky that it happened when it did, because if it had happened going down a hill or going at high speeds, I could have been severely injured or even killed. While I was definitely lucky in that situation, the next week didn't go as well. First, there was a possum that came into the house a couple days later. I was in the kitchen making some lunch when I turned around and saw the thing climbing up onto the kitchen table, sniffing for food. The damn thing hissed at me and I about shit a brick. I was able to get a broom and chase the thing back out the back door, which is where it had likely come in through since I'd left it ajar. Then there was the day I was walking onto the front porch with my grandma's teapot to pour her another cup of the freshly made green tea. Next thing I know, I take a step forward and trip over the broom I'd been using earlier to clear off the porch. I tried to catch myself but ended up on the ground, slamming my grandma's teapot into the porch, shattering it against the railing as I went down and covering my arm in hot tea. She'd had that teapot since she was 19 and now it laid in pieces all over the porch. But she didn't get upset with me because it was a thing and things can be replaced. All that mattered was that I was okay. Of course, the burning sensation on my arm said that I wasn't okay, so she helped me into the house and we gauzed up my hand and arm after applying some ointment. It really wasn't my week, I remember thinking to myself. But there was another problem going on outside of the string of bad luck I'd had that week. There was also the dreams. Strange dreams. Now when I say strange, I don't mean that I was having dreams that would be equal to an acid trip. I mean that I had the same dream. Or rather the same general dream. I would find myself out in the forest, but it wasn't a normal kind of forest. It's hard to explain, but the skies were always cloudy, giving an overcast that would block out the sun, making things look gray, almost as if it could start raining at any moment. The trees, however, were really what struck me as odd. First off, all the colors of the trees were all over the place. Greens, reds, oranges, yellows, pinks. It was almost like looking at all the seasons happening at once. But I wasn't looking at trees you'd normally see. One tree kind of looked like a maple tree, but the leaves were different. It wasn't the normal 5-point that I'd seen on the Canadian flag or even around my parents' house. This one had leaves with 7 points and were a deep red. There were also trees with blossoming flowers on it, a pinkish white bloom to be exact. It took a moment, but I realized that the flower I was looking at was a cherry blossom. But amongst those were another type of tree with what looked like a deep pink with fruit hanging from them. A plum or apricot, maybe? I thought to myself. The trunks themselves seemed to be in a state of flux, for lack of a better term. It was like they were shifting in and out of existence, but the leaves and petals overhead would always remain, some even falling, creating a rain effect when the wind would blow. Hello? Is anyone out there? The echo of my voice would carry on for miles around, it sounded. But no response. I'd continue to wonder, but would never encounter anything, nothing human, animal, or otherwise. Eventually I'd find a tree stump in the middle of a clearing, and I'd find myself compelled to sit on it. So I'd approach and gently sit down on it, observing the ring of different trees surrounding me. And then out of the corner of my eye, I'd see something moving along the tree line. However, when I turned my head to look, there'd be nothing there. Just the trees. This would happen a few times, and then I'd start to hear whispering. The sounds would echo around me, and I could never tell what they were saying or where they were coming from. Suddenly the clouds would part slightly overhead, and above would be the sun. However, it was partially eclipsed, looking like it was waning. I would then hear the sound of strange music. As I'd look back down, I'd notice a woman standing in front of me, playing a flute of some type. It looked like it was made of bamboo and was held almost like a recorder flute you'd play in grade school. She wore what looked like a priestess outfit. I only knew that because I'd occasionally watched anime and had some very vague ideas of the culture because of it. However, instead of the normal white and red colors that were the norm, as far as my limited knowledge was concerned, hers was different. A long, deep brown skirt and a deep green top, which I believe was a kimono or something along that nature. Again, I'm not very good with Japanese culture, although I was pretty sure it was a Japanese form of dress and that the woman wearing it was also Japanese. Her hair was long and raven black, ending about mid-back. She had skin that was fair and looked smooth and unblemished. She would slowly approach me, still playing the eerie tune of the bamboo flute in her hands. The music would drift through the air, causing the hairs on my neck to stand on end. Something about the tune sent a chill down my spine, and I would suddenly start to feel as if something was missing. I felt hollow. She would come closer as each moment passed, and no matter how much I told myself to get up and run, I would be unable to move. Occasionally I would look up at the sun overhead and notice that it was becoming more and more eclipsed by what I could only guess was the moon. Eventually she was standing a mere few inches away from where I sat. Slowly she would lower the flute from her mouth and look directly into my eyes. The iris of her eyes were black and made it hard to tell where her pupils ended and they began. She was strikingly beautiful, but with that beauty came the hint of the horror that was beneath the surface. She was wrong, and I couldn't figure out what it was. Maybe it was the dark brown lipstick she wore, which made her grin look a bit creepy. Or perhaps it was those eyes, almost as if they could see into my soul. Whatever it was, I knew I shouldn't be near her. I knew I needed to get away. She would then hold up the flute and slowly point the end that she played from towards me. She would move it in close, and the area around where we were would become darker and darker. Eventually, the end of the flute would touch my forehead. I'd suddenly wake up, shooting straight up in bed, the sweat pouring down my face and my breathing shaky and quick. Looking around, I'd be greeted with the view of my room, still and quiet. The only light coming from the moon shining through my window. The dream repeated itself for almost 2 weeks, and I wasn't getting a lot of sleep. My grandma noticed this, and it caused her a lot of concern. My eyes were getting bags under them, dark and very noticeable ones. I was sluggish and irritable a lot too, but she never once got upset with me when I would get snarky with her. Of course, I'd always apologize afterwards. It wasn't her fault after all that I was in a bad mood. It seemed like things just wanted to keep getting worse though. After one of Grandma's recent visits to her doctor, it showed that things were getting worse, and it was starting to show on her. The smile wasn't able to hide the pain and discomfort as much as it had when I first got there. That, added on with the lack of sleep, plus other incidents of what can only be called bad luck, just kept driving me deeper into the hole of aggravation and sadness. But things were about to take a turn for the worse. The dream again. The exact same dream. It was a statistical impossibility. No one can have the exact same dream repeat itself over and over again for 2.5 weeks. There should be something else in the dream, or hell, it should have been different dreams, or none at all some nights at the very least. However, one night, something did change in it. It wasn't anything big, like a dragon appearing, or hell, even a different dream. No, it was the exact same dream, on repeat again for the 19th straight night. However, this time, just as she was about to touch the end of the flute to my forehead, she looked into my eyes and spoke. The first time I heard her voice, it was calm, quiet, and disturbing. Something about it petrified me. Now, when I say she spoke, I don't mean she said a sentence or anything like that. It was one word, as far as I could tell anyways. A single word. Zetsubou. The end of the flute touched my forehead, and I was up again, just like I'd been the other nights. I got up out of bed and started to head to the bathroom. Just as I was walking out into the hallway, I tripped and met the floor with my face. I grunted as I struck the ground and rolled over onto my back. I slammed my fist into the ground as I held my forehead with the other hand. I started to sit up. What the hell did I trip over? It took a minute for my eyes to focus in the dark, as well as after smacking my head on the hardwood floor. As I sat there rubbing my head, my sight returning to normal, I saw what I had tripped over. The air escaped my lungs. I couldn't breathe. My heart started beating out of my chest. I let out a few whimpers in an attempt to scream, but that's all I could muster. There on the floor in front of me was my grandma. I crawled over to her, and as I did, the small amount of moonlight coming in from the window allowed me to see everything. Her eyes lay open wide, almost as if they were in shock. Around her, a pool of fresh blood had formed around her head. I tried to shake her, accidentally getting my hand in the blood on the floor. I called out to her, "Grandma! Grandma, say something!" But I got no response. Her cold cold stare was the only answer I got. I eventually got out of the shock of the scene enough to get to a phone and call 911. An ambulance was there about 20 minutes later. I'd unlocked the door as the dispatcher had told me to and walked almost absent-mindedly back to my grandma's side. The paramedics entered and then made their way to where I sat, leaned up against the wall under the windows, looking into the eyes of Grandma. The eyes so full of life that I'd known for 19 years were now cold and empty. All of the warmth and comfort they had had were gone. They checked on her and asked me a few questions as to what had happened. I told them that I'd been asleep and had gotten up to go to the bathroom, and that's when I found her. They took her body away on the stretcher, and as they covered up her head before they left the house, I felt a twinge of pain in my gut. The feelings whirled inside of me as I closed the door behind them. The room started to spin, and I felt lightheaded. After a few moments of this, I fell to my knees and hurled all over the floor. The tears were welling in my eyes as I began to dry heave. I sat there, bent over a mixture of vomit and tears as I tried to straighten up and catch my breath again. And as I did, I noticed the room was filled with the brilliant blue shimmering light of the jewel. The moon was shining into the window just enough to reflect off the jewel, still sitting in its place on the mantel. My blood was still pumping hard in my ears from the vicious puking I'd been doing. But for a moment, I swore I heard whispers coming from around the room. That night, after cleaning up the mess I'd made at the front door, I decided to lay down on the couch. I didn't want to go back to my room and pass by the spot where I'd found her, where the blood still was. I just pulled out a blanket and pillow from the nearby closet that we used for guests and plopped down on the couch. My body was worn out from the events, and it didn't take long for me to sob myself to sleep. Sure enough, as soon as my eyes were closed, the dream came again. The second time in the same night. It went the same as before, the same forest, the same sky, the same everything. And again, she appeared with the sound of the flute echoing in the nothingness around us. The priestess approached, as she always did, still playing as always. She reached where I sat, and again, pulled the flute from her lips, and gave me that cold smile. But this time, she looked to my right. She never looked away from me before. My gaze followed, and honestly, I wish it hadn't. There, standing next to me, was my grandma. She wore a blood-soaked bandana and the nightgown she had been wearing when I found her. But I noticed something very odd about her. Just below the front of her neck, on her chest, there was a red stone. It was shaped almost like a big comma, and it had a hole near the top end of it. My grandma just looked at me with those dead eyes, just like she had had when I found her. Except this time, I could detect sadness in them. I turned my gaze back to the priestess, and as I did, she touched the flute to my forehead, and again she said to me, "Zetsubou." I shot up on the couch, nearly falling out of it. The sun was up, but it wasn't very bright out. It must have been pretty early still. It took me a moment, but I noticed there was someone standing at the door. The shadow on the other side of the covered glass knocked sternly. It must have woken me up, I thought to myself, rationalizing why I'd shot up so fast, almost like it had surprised me. I heard a voice from the other side of the door. "This is Officer Jameston. Please open the door." I got to my feet as quickly as I could and walked over to the door. I opened it, and sure enough, I was greeted by the face of a police officer. I rubbed my eyes and asked, "Can I help you, sir?" "Son, I think you need to come with me." I stood there for a moment trying to get my bearings. I asked him if this was about my grandma, but all I said was, "I need you to put your hands over your head and turn around, please." It took a moment for me to register what was going on. Finally it hit me, and I slowly did as I was told. I heard the scraping of metal as he grabbed my right arm. I felt the handcuff against my skin as he latched it around my wrist, and he began to read off Miranda rights. His voice was getting distant, pushed away by my own thoughts as to what was happening. I was being accused for Grandma's death. I was accused of murder. The officer's voice was trailing off as he was reading my rights to me, but they were almost drowned out by the sound of whispers. The whispers were there again. I couldn't understand what they were saying as I felt him tug at me and guide me out of my grandma's house. The whispers were still there as he sat me in the back seat and closed the door on me. My world was falling apart around me, and I had no idea why. It made no sense. How could I be accused of murder? What the hell was going on? What is with that dream? The road ahead was going to get much worse, much to my despair. The answer to those questions, I had to find them. I wished I hadn't. But fate, it seems, is cruel.